despite the fact that we're, 30 years into being professional employer branding as a function, our metrics are still a little weak. They're very much either cribbed from the marketing team and the branding team, or they're just paying attention to what talent acquisition says. And I really see metrics being so much more. I'd like to show you some opportunities we can all have to make better employer brand metrics. But first, you absolutely have to define employer brand. I know it seems crazy that we still have to do it, but here we are. Simply put, what one person thinks it must be like to work for you based on their experiences and touch points aggregated together in the whole. That is what we mean by an employer brand. Your definition may differ, but this is what we're going to work with today. But the real question here, the thing we need to start with is what seems like a simple question truly isn't. It's why do you want to measure your employer brand? What should be an obvious question is not. It simply is not, because I think depending on how you answer this question, you're going to use different kind of metrics. Now, the first obvious way of why you would measure your employer brand is to compare yourself to the competition. We've all heard the joke about how you can't outrun the bear, but you can outrun the other person. A lot of times, great employer branding isn't so much about being the best, but simply about besting your competition, right? So being able to understand how you fare relative to the competition is very useful in employer brand. 2, to show your improvement. And in order to do that, we have to find opportunities and issues and fix them. We're going to talk about that in depth. And 3rd, to justify your existence, to make sure that you continue getting your paycheck, which, well, let's be fair, that's always on everyone's mind. But let's dive in. So first off, we want to compare ourselves to the competition. Depending on what industry and depending on what geography and which, well, frankly, depending on who we are, our competition set is where we start with our employer brand. We don't have to be necessarily the best company, but we simply want to be the best of the options, right? That is a strong position to be in. But how do you do that? Well, you measure comparative brand strength, and I break them up into 2 buckets: sentiment and reach. Sentiment being, are you helping people like the idea of working for you? Are you encouraging them? Are you telling stories about how to feel good about your company, right? So simply the idea of what must it be like to work there, that I feel good about the idea of working there. The second is reach. Are you pushing that message out to enough people? Are they hearing it? Are they repeating it out? What is your reach? How many people are you touching? How many people are you extending that message to? Now, when we look at it that way, we start to realize that there's a lot of different, let's call them data points, that we can tap into for each one of these buckets. For sentiment, it's Glassdoor scores, it's referral ranking or ratings, it's being on one of those most attractive company rankings, how many people are applying for each rec, what is your engagement on social by people who aren't staff, right? How much do people like you? How much do they want to work for you? The other is reach, and those are actually the easiest metrics, right? It's numbers of followers, numbers of fans, what kind of career traffic you get, how you're ranking on job boards and Google for jobs and just Google in general, and how much traffic you get to all the various microsites and other platforms you build. So what you want to do is collect a lot of these metrics so that you can do this. I'm just going to draw a tiny little kind of XY graph. Very simple. You're going to measure reach and sentiment. And that's pretty straightforward. Your sentiment is going to be things like, well, how much do people like working with us? Now, the trick here is there's no right answer to where you draw this line. Simply pick a spot that feels good, and you'll see why in a minute. Then look at your reach metrics and pick another spot that feels good. What are your numbers like? How much traffic do you get? How much do people talk about you? Then kind of graph them together so that you form a box. And this area is the relative strength of your brand. Now, the word relative is important because you can't have relative in a vacuum. You can't have a relative strength of your brand without comparing it to something. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to look at a competition or competitor and look at their same kind of numbers and graph them as well. So once you've identified your area of strength, you look at their relative area of strength. In this case, the competition has much better reach. They're spending lots more money on ads. They're pushing out more content on social. They're promoting stuff on social, whatever it might be, whatever's beating you in the reach game, but they're not beating you in the sentiment game, right? Your kind of hash mark for your sentiment and reach is just kind of a flag in the ground to say, okay, this is where we are, and now I'm going to show how we compare to other companies. And your job is to say, okay, how do we expand our rectangle to take up maximum area? You want to push it out on both dimensions so you have the best brand, right? If that's where you want to be, that is a brand that is dwarfing that of the blue competitor. Even though they have more reach, your sentiment is so much better that it wins. That's a very simple way of comparing yourself against any competitor. It helps you understand where should you be spending your time to beat them. By the way, I'm James Ellis. I didn't get a chance to introduce myself. I'm a director of employer brand for Universum. I'm based in Chicago, which it would explain the accent. I have a podcast. We're now in year 4 of the Talent Cast. I publish a newsletter every week called Employer Brand Headlines. I tweet, I write books, all sorts of wonderful stuff. If you want to find me, I'm very findable online. Now, so the next reason we might want to consider measuring our employer brand is to show our improvement, that we're doing a great job. And you do a great job mostly by finding issues and opportunities that you can kind of fix and solve and improve, right? So let's break that down. This is a little more complicated, but it's much more clear. There's a lot more direction, actionability in this kind of metric than there is in the comparative metrics. So an employer brand is simply, what is your employer brand? How do you create it? Times how you manage it, right? What is it like to work here? The idea of it, the concept of it, and how you promote it and push it out to as many people as possible. And we're going to break each one of these down just a bit further. So first, employer brand creation is what you reward minus your individual motivations relative to your industry or competitive set. Let's make that simple. What you offer a candidate, what you offer an employee that makes their life better, right? Something they care about, something they value relative to their other employer options. So if you're talking about work-life balance, if you're in a law firm, work-life balance might mean, hey, you only have to work 10 or 12 hours instead of the standard 12 to 14. That's great work-life balance. That work-life balance may make no sense in an e-commerce space or a retail space or a manufacturing space where 8 hours of the day is the norm. So you really have to understand what your competitive and opportunity set are. Compare that to what your employer brand management looks like. Now, this will start to feel complex, but it's really very, very easy to digest. What you're talking about is, what is the perception of the brand? What you do, how you do it, why you do it, and how do you scale it? The reach, alignment, and authenticity, right? We're going to dive into those real quick. So it should make real clear sense in just a second. But on the other side, you have employer brand management. Now, this looks more complicated than it really is, because ultimately it's simply this. How do you shape the conceptual, the perception, the core idea of your brand, and how do you scale it? So the perception, the conception, the idea of it is, what do you do, how do you do it, and why do you do it? And the scaling is about how do you extend the reach, how do you make sure it's aligned, and how do you make sure it feels authentic, its credibility. If any of those things are out of focus, if any of these things score poorly, it kind of wipes out most of your scoring across the board. If you have great, clear industry, culture, mission, size, and focus, but you're completely unbelievable, putting a 0 on that spot kind of wipes out all the other numbers, right? It's the timesing by 0 kind of formulation. Here's the deal. Let's put it all together so you can understand that there's all these different moving parts to your employer brand, and every single one of them is important, right? We're going to say, what do we do to reward the candidate that they care about? What does it look like relative to their industry? Is this a means of differentiation, or is this table stakes? If you're a pharmaceutical company and you're talking about how great your innovation is, well, I hate to tell you, but everybody talks about, in the pharma space, talks about innovation. You have to get beyond that. But ultimately, this becomes your who. Who is the person you're trying to reach? What do they care about? Talking about the audience space. The other side is the what, the how, and the why, and you can break it down to understand exactly where your problems are. So if you throw some numbers in there, and yes, they're relative numbers, I get that, but if you throw some numbers in there, you can start to see where your problems are. In fact, if you map it out like this, and you say for each one of these ideas, the who, the what, the how, the why, the reach, the clarity, the credibility, who's responsible for each? How are you doing in each? And what are some projects and tactics you can apply to fix that problem? Much of employer brand is stymied by the fact that there's so much you could do. How do you focus your energy on the things that matter? Now, if the metric's about how do you justify your existence, I leave that to you and your boss. I'm not going to get in the middle of that. I'm not nuts. However, there's something else. There's something, in fact, I would refer to as better. Because all these metrics you've seen so far are very backwards facing. How did we do? How did that campaign work? Did we move the needle? It's all about the past. And we think metrics need to be about the past, but in fact, good metrics can actually help you define your own future. Yes, it can be done, and let me show you how. I would say you take a lesson from marketing. So let's say we have a product that's designed to appeal to a 24 to 26-year-old man, right? Maybe someone who doesn't have college education, but the product, that is the focus of that product. Well, how do you market that product? Without even going into what the product is, you probably have some good guesses. Well, it's going to have some sort of function of sex appeal, right? It's going to have an attractive person talking in the ad. It's probably going to reference sports in some way, maybe cars, or maybe video games, right? It's going to focus on the things that a 24 to 26-year-old non-college educated person, man, is going to care about. Right? You don't pitch that product to me because I'm old and I've got a college education. It doesn't appeal to me. Those things don't appeal to me in the same way that they do to the 24-year-old. And if you're talking to a woman, the stuff that appeals to a woman and that might appeal to me might not be the same. Really, that's how marketing thinks. It understands who wants this thing and tailors its message around that. Because if you know in advance what messages are going to resonate, you're going to have better engagement. If you know you're trying to reach a 24-year-old, you know those are the things you should talk about and not taxation policy, not about policy, politics, not about, the things that maybe a 24-year-old doesn't care as much about, right? If you know in advance what messages are going to stick, you'll know that you're going to get better engagement. So let me give you an example inside our space. Now, this is based on US data, so bear that in mind. If you want to attract more women to your tech teams, that is computer science people, developers, coders, architects, what have you, right? Which of these three messages should you use? Is it support for gender equality? Is it flexible working conditions? Is it competitive-based salary? Now, for a lot of you, when you're answering that question, you go, well, obviously women care about gender equality, so that's the driver. But I'd be careful with that. Is that something that's going to resonate? Will it resonate more than it does for men? Perhaps, but is it a strong driver? And that's the trick. When you're building your message to talk to different audiences, you're often guessing about what they care about. And that's where the data, the metrics, can really help you define which message to go with. Because it turns out support for gender equality scores very, very middle of the road for women, and even worse for men. However, flexible working conditions scores incredibly highly among women, even more so than it does for men. Competitive-based salary scores pretty well for women, but it does work better for men. Understanding what the audience you're trying to talk to cares about, getting data, getting metrics that help you understand what they're focused on, what they care about, helps you decide how to make better decisions about your messaging. And you can actually get as much as a 3 times increase in response and engagement if you simply use a message that's made for them. I mean, that's not crazy. That's really what marketing does every single day. And there's a lot of lessons we could be stealing from that. And that's called predictive metrics. And predictive metrics allow you to understand what's going to happen before it actually happens. You can know that in that case of the women in technology, that focusing on gender equality simply isn't going to move the needle nearly as much as focusing on work-life balance or flexibility. That's what's going to move the needle. It's going to help you make better decisions about the messages you put out in the world. So that brings us back to the beginning. If you know what you want your metrics to do, if you know what those metrics are for, you can decide which and when metrics to use to punch above your weight in the talent game. Thanks so much for listening. I'm James Ellis. Like I said, lots of ways to find me. If you like what I had to talk about, either find my podcast or find one of my books. They're getting great reviews. I think you'll enjoy it. Thanks again. Bye.